Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about a major new report on climate change that warns of a crisis that could hit in the next 2 decades or so. We continue now with our panel, and I want to start this part of the show with Anjali. Anjali, you talked earlier on about India and the fact that climate change is already having an impact on the country. But if we look at India, it's a country that still uses a lot of fossil fuel for its energy. How does it reduce its dependence on these kinds of fuels?
Well, India is extremely important to solving climate change. It's currently the 3rd largest emitter in the world. It has the 2nd largest population in the world, close to China. And India is doing a lot on climate change. India has over 300 days of sunshine. So there's a huge opportunity for solar energy. What we're seeing from the solar energy prices in India has surprised the markets. It's cheaper than fossil fuels. The government and the political will in India is behind advancing and accelerating solar energy, wind energy, and energy efficiency. India's Paris climate targets are ambitious and achievable. In addition to solar and wind energy, the electric vehicle market is an emerging market area that's extremely important to the Indian economy as an emerging market and consumer class. The second big issue that's really important is the demand for cooling, air conditioning. India currently only has less than 10% of air conditioning usage in India. And when you see peak power demand, peak power outages, they happen when the temperatures skyrocket and the air conditioners go on, and they cause power outages in Bombay. Bringing on more efficient air conditioners, as well as reducing the demand for cooling with simple solutions like cool roofs, energy efficient buildings are critical. The Indian government just last week released a national cooling action plan, the first nation to have such a plan. The last century, a lot of the energy expenditure was spent on warming buildings, on keeping people warm. This century, we know that it's going to be hugely focused on cooling in South Asia, Southeast Asia, as income levels rise, and climate change just compounds that. So air conditioning and keeping people cool is not just a matter of comfort anymore, it's a matter of life or death. The third thing that India is doing too is working to protect vulnerable communities. India has one of the most innovative early warning systems for extreme heat that's been adopted and for local conditions in over 30 cities in 11 states, planning on moving that up to the 17 heat-prone states in India. Similarly, early warning systems for flooding are critical and crucial. Agriculture, habitat, how people eat, that's also a big part of climate change and how we use that. So India is doing a lot and is on track to meet its Paris targets. What this report tells us is that we need to see more from India and other countries to ramp up this target to sprint into action.
All right, Tyson, let's talk about the United States. I have 2 parts to my question. First, let me ask you, do you see any enthusiasm to invest in alternative sources of energy here in the United States?
From a market perspective, absolutely. Almost all of the new generation coming online in the U.S. power sector, it's all being driven by renewables. Because if you've got capital to invest in the power system, that's where you're going to go, because it's the easiest to deploy and it's the least cost energy resource. We're also seeing lots of investment into energy storage, and the cost curve on energy storage, which is critically important to balance out the intermittency of renewables going forward. You're seeing a lot of enthusiasm around that. You're seeing, obviously, a lot of excitement around electric vehicles. Right. But the challenge is that we need to have investments in infrastructure, and this is where the federal government in the United States continues to lag. We're not seeing the overwhelming majority of Americans that want to see cleaner energy. Their views are not being reflected in the current administration. The current administration is really taking its marching orders from a very small group of what I would say are economic losers in the energy game.
Right, and that brings me to the second part of my question, and that is the politics of this challenge in the United States. What is it going to take for there to be a rethink on where the United States stands on the battle against climate?
Well, I think it's going to take some of the big fossil fuel companies to do leadership. Just this week, we saw ExxonMobil, one of the largest oil companies in the world based in Texas. They just committed to spend $1 million a year lobbying for a federal carbon tax. So I think this is a good start, that ExxonMobil acknowledges that we need to have some sort of federal price on carbon and that they're committing some resources. Now, $1 million to a multi-billion-dollar company isn't enough, but at least it's a start, because what we need to, in order to convince Republicans in the United States, we've got to have fossil fuel companies say, listen, we all need to understand that the science of climate change is settled, the Earth is warming, and now we need to work on legislative and regulatory solutions. And so having fossil fuel companies saying that message is going to be key.
Well, Changhua, one of the things that this report makes very clear is that the world will have to get rid of coal as a source of energy, and coal needs to be, as they point out, needs to be phased out sooner rather than later. How realistic is that?
I think depending on where you are, which countries, which regions are we're talking about. I think from China perspective, from energy security perspective, coal probably will continue to have a role, certain level of role to play in China's overall energy structure. If coal continues to be the energy structure, we all know CCS or CCUS has to be part of the solution. Otherwise, we won't be able to achieve actually the target or 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees at all. So I wouldn't just totally blame it, so coal is the one to blame. But if somehow in some regions coal will continue to have a role to play, then you have to look into to add into the portfolio actually CCS to make sure carbon emissions is very well taken care of. Otherwise, the coal shouldn't stay any longer.
Right. While we heard in our report there at the beginning of the show that small island nations, communities on small island nations are the most vulnerable. One of the island nations that we hear of very often is the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. How endangered are these nations?
First, let me comment on something that was said. I mean, only in the U.S. you rely on a private company to save the collapse of human civilization. I think, yes, companies and private sector has a role to play, but really we cannot put, the survival of our kids and all our children's future on a private company. I think what is important for the U.S. is elections. We have midterm elections coming, and 2020 another election. People need to know that climate change, it's not only a threat for small islands. Any kid now, any child that we have has no future in the long term at the moment. And the decision for the future of these children is going to be done in the coming 10 years. So every election counts. Brazil was mentioned. It's a bit scary what's happening in Brazil, but also the United States, we have a big challenge coming at the end of this year and 2020. The climate leadership that we're seeing actually at the moment is coming from the islands that you're talking about. The Marshall Islands now heads the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a 48-country coalition working on climate change. These are the most vulnerable countries, the poorest islands, but not only islands, all developing countries, countries in Africa, least developed countries, and they are challenging the big countries. They're taking leadership themselves. The Climate Vulnerable Forum is organizing a summit, heads of government summit in November 22, challenging the big countries, saying we're going to go to zero emissions by 2050. We're going to transform to 100% renewable energy, and they're asking other countries to commit to the same, join them in the summit, and this is the kind of challenge that political challenge that these islands are doing. And we shouldn't underestimate these challenges because these small islands depend on aid from these big countries. For example, the Marshall Islands, 70% of GDP comes from the United States, and they are still taking the challenge of standing up to these countries and their policies. So there's a lot of bravery and a lot of commitment. If an island in the middle of the Pacific can go 100% renewable energy, there's no excuse for the bigger countries to do the same.
Anjali, one final point, and that is we hear of the challenges that the world faces. We hear of what countries are trying to do, but how close are we to a tipping point where the Earth's viability is going to be threatened?
Oh, I think we are extremely close to the tipping point. The IPCC report and the 90 scientists are telling us very clearly we need to sprint into action. And I wanted to come back on the point on coal. For emerging economies like India, China, the dependence on coal has been clear in terms of the development and that what's needed. But we are not in 2010 anymore. We have seen how technologies work. As we heard, small island nations moving to 100% clean energy. The major economies, the third largest emitter in the world, India, the first largest, China, the second largest, the United States, need to move towards clean energy today at an accelerated pace, and that is at the heart of this report. It shows how we can do it economically and how it saves lives.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.